Right, so today on this bit of the bookshelf tour, something a little bit different. I'm going to go through all of the history books that I've got and all of the mythology, sort of legends, folklore kind of books that I've got as well. I've got a fair few of them. Well, I'll show you. So these are all the books. There's a pretty good mix of sort of broad reference books and books on more specific topics. There's a few biographies in there, anthologies of myths and legends. In terms of subject matter as well, there's like plenty of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Celtic civilization. We've got the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans represented as well. So yeah, history is an area that ancient and medieval history in particular, is something I'm really interested in, so this makes up quite a good chunk of my non-fiction books in total. So yeah, without further ado, here we go. Okay, so first up we've got the Wordsworth Dictionary of British History and the Chambers Dictionary of World History. And then we've got The Incredible Human Journey by Alice Roberts, which kind of tells the story of how humans as a species colonised the world. And then we've got A Handbook to Life in Prehistoric Europe by Jane McIntosh, which is kind of a reference guide. Next up we've got Home by Frances Pryor, who you might know from Time Team, which documents how the concept of home has changed throughout prehistory. Next up is A History of Ancient Britain by Neil Oliver, which is based on the TV documentary series that he did. Next up we've got Travel in the Ancient World by Lionel Casson. And then Ancient Inventions by Peter James and Nick Thorpe, which is like a nice little coffee table book that just goes through and tells you all kinds of stuff that you didn't think they had in the ancient world, but they did. Stuff like automatic doors and things like that. You know, apparently they had them in ancient Egypt. And speaking of ancient Egypt, this is An Introduction to Ancient Egypt by T.G.H. James. And then we've got Greece and the Hellenistic World by John Boardman, Jasper Griffin and Oswin Murray, which is part of the Oxford History of the Classical World series. And Ancient Greek Literature by K.J. Dover and others, which is just like a nice short little overview of the subject. And then we've got The Western Way of War by Victor Davis Hanson, and this is quite an interesting book that kind of puts forward the argument that the concept of the citizen soldier, you know, for example, like what we saw in the First and Second World Wars, actually originated in ancient Greece, and it's got a load of interesting historical stuff as well. I mean, whether you agree with the argument or not, it's still quite an interesting read. And here we've got The Spartans, An Epic History by Paul Cartledge, which, to be honest, it's more of a narrative history, so if you really want to go into depth about Spartan society, this is not the book. But if you just want to know what were the major events in Spartan history, then this is a good one, and it's quite a short read. And then to counterbalance that, we've got The Athenians and Their Empire by Malcolm F. McGregor, which is a similar treatment of the Athenians. And then we've got Persian Fire by Tom Holland, and Tom Holland is like quite a big name in popular history, and this is a book that he's done about the Persian Empire and their relations with the Greek world. And here we've got The Celtic Empire by Peter Beresford Ellis, which covers the first millennium BC, and Peter Beresford Ellis, he's a Celt himself, a self-proclaimed Celt, so he's definitely got an agenda in all his books about Celts, but he is one of the main authorities on the subject, so yeah, worth the read if you're interested in that. And then we've got another book by Alice Roberts, The Celts, Search for a Civilization, which is another one that's based on a BBC TV series. And then another Peter Beresford Ellis one, A Brief History of the Celts, which is a good short introduction if you don't want to read one of his longer books. And by the same author, I've got A Brief History of the Druids. And then another book by Tom Holland, this is probably his most famous one, it's Rubicon, which is about the rise of the Roman Republic. And then we've got a couple of books by Adrian Goldsworthy about Rome, and he's quite an old school historian. You don't get a lot of sort of social history with him. This one is basically a list of short biographies of key figures during the Roman Empire. This one's called In the Name of Rome. And also by him I've got The Complete Roman Army, which is a fantastic introduction to the subject, I've got to say. And then we've got The Pelican History of England, Roman Britain by I.A. Richmond, which is, this edition that I've got is a little bit out of date now, but it's still an interesting read as long as you take into account that, research has moved on since then. But if you really do want to go in depth on Roman Britain, then I would suggest this one, which is also called Roman Britain. It's by Peter Solway, and this is far more up to date, and it pretty much, covers everything. And then we've got Londinium by John Morris, which is a study of London, the city of London, during the Roman period. And then I've got an abridged version of Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which, again, this is a very outdated book about the subject, but it was hugely influential at the time and is still hugely influential in how we view the topic. It was written during the time of the British Empire, and you can really tell, so you have to bear that in mind when you're reading it. And then we've got The Transformation of the Roman World, which was edited by Leslie Webster and Michelle Brown, and this is an absolute classic on the subject of what is traditionally thought of as the end of the Roman Empire. It puts forward a completely different argument, and when it came out this was a real game changer. And next up we've got The Barbarian West, 400 to 1000 by J.M. Wallace Hadrill, which is a short introduction to the period, and this is another sort of classic that you'll read on pretty much any university course that covers this period. And then I've got a few overviews of the sort of period of late antiquity going through to the early medieval. This is an introduction to early medieval Western Europe, 300 to 9000 by Matthew Innes, and it's really a broad reference book. And then we've got Early Medieval Europe, 300 to 1000 by Roger Collins. And I mean, none of these broad reference ones are books that you would read cover to cover, but if you've got a specific question about a certain geographical region at a certain time, then these are the ones you turn to. And then we've got The Early Middle Ages, The Birth of Europe by Lynette Olson, and English Society in the Early Middle Ages by Doris Mary Stenton, which again is a Pelican History of England series, and slightly out of date but still an interesting read and very short. And another reference book here, A Short History of the Middle Ages by Barbara H. Rosenwein. Now this is a book that I was given, and again, quite out of date, but it's always interesting to read out of date books, history books anyway, because it gives you a sense of what people used to think about a subject, and that can really inform your own views on the topic. So anyway, this is Barbarians, Christians and Muslims. The general editor was Trevor Cairns, and it's Cambridge University Press. A bit more popular history by Tom Holland. This is In the Shadow of the Sword. And then we've got Sir Frank Stenton's Anglo-Saxon England, which is an absolute classic on the subject. Again, it has been superseded by newer research, but anything that's written on Anglo-Saxon England will have been informed by this in some way. And then we've got The Anglo-Saxon Age by D.J.V. Fisher. And then we've got The Real Middle-earth by Brian Bates, which is kind of a book that puts forward the argument, or tries to understand the Anglo-Saxon world through their own eyes and their own stories. I'm not sure that I agree with quite a few things that he says, but it's still an interesting read, and it certainly got me thinking. And then we've got the first of a few books that I've got about King Arthur. It's a topic that I'm quite interested in. If you've seen the fiction section of my bookshelf tour, you'll know that already. This is A Brief History of King Arthur, and it's by Mike Ashley, and goes through a lot of different options about who King Arthur could have been, whether he was a real historical figure or not. It's a very good introduction to the subject. And then we've got Worlds of Arthur by Guy Horsell, which is a really excellent read. He's actually one of my favourite historians to read. He's got very good writing style, and in this book he basically sort of says, yeah, we can't really know much about King Arthur, which, I mean, is pretty reasonable, but yeah, he also gives an awful lot of knowledge about the period that King Arthur is most likely to have come from anyway, so it's a very good historical book in that sense anyway. And then we've got Arthur's Britain by Leslie Alcock, which is less about King Arthur and more about the history of Britain itself from the mid-4th to the mid-7th century. And then we've got Geoffrey Ash's King Arthur's Avalon, the story of Glastonbury, which has got some interesting ideas in it, but again, this is one of those sort of books that is putting forward a theory that you really need to think through yourself and decide how much of it you agree with. And then we've got another Tom Holland book, Millennium, which is kind of a broad overview of what was going on in Europe around the turn of the first millennium. Then we've got a bit of popular history by Mark Morris, The Norman Conquest, which is pretty self-explanatory. And then on the same topic, we've got the first of 3 books that I've got by Peter Rex. This is 1066, A New History of the Norman Conquest. And also by him we've got The English Resistance, which talks about the English resistance to the Norman Conquest. And then his biography of Hereward, who was a semi-legendary Anglo-Saxon outlaw who was a key figure in the resistance to the Norman conquest of England. Then we've got The Normans by R. Allen Brown. And then we've got Domesday Book to Magna Carta by A. L. Poole, which is kind of just a history of England in the 12th century. Next up we've got The Crusades by Zoe Oldenburg, which is really a seminal work on this subject. Then we've got a biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine by Alison Weir. A biography of Richard the Lionheart, which is Richard I, by John Gillingham. A Great and Terrible King by Mark Morris, which is a biography of Edward I. A biography of The Black Prince by Michael Jones. And a biography of Tamerlane by Justin Morozzi. Then we've got Conquest by Juliet Barker, which covers the English Kingdom of France in the 100 Years' War period. And this is an absolute classic work of historical writing. It's Montaillou by Emmanuel Leroy Laderie, and this just kind of provides like a snapshot of one little tiny village in medieval France, but he takes a really big picture approach. I mean, he talks about how the geography and the cosmology affects them, as well as just, you know, all the day-to-day stuff that goes on in this village. And this is another book that really changed how people thought about history and about how we study history. Then we've got another one of the Pelican History of England series. This one's by A.R. Myers, and it's England in the Late Middle Ages. And then we've got Constantinople, The Last Great Siege, 1453 by Roger Crowley, which documents the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks. And we've got A Brief History of the English Civil Wars by John Miller. And then I've got a box set of the 4 volumes of G.M. Trevelyan's Illustrated English Social History. And then we've got Histories of Nations, which is quite an interesting little book that has loads of really short chapters about individual countries by writers from those countries, talking about how they see their own national identity. Then we've got Empire by Niall Ferguson, which is about the British Empire. Subtitle is How Britain Made the Modern World, which is perhaps overstating it a little bit, but nevertheless. And then we've got The West by John E. Lewis, which is a history of the American West, basically. And then we've got Waterloo by Bernard Cornwell, which is a history of the Battle of Waterloo. And then it's kind of moving more into mythology now, so the rest of the books are kind of more mythology. Also there's some sort of ancient primary sources that I've got as well. It's hard to sort of define exactly where they fall, so yeah. But anyway, so this is Joseph Campbell's classic work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which is like an examination of ancient hero myths and similarities between the myths of different cultures. And then we've got Greece and Rome, Myths and Legends, which is, as the title suggests, a load of different myths and legends from Greece and Rome. And then the Iliad by Homer, and also the Odyssey by Homer. We've got Tales of the Greek Heroes by Roger Lancelyn Green. And now normally after this one I would have my Robert Graves. I've got both of his books that he did on Greek myths, but I've lent them to a friend at the moment. And what I would say is, if you want that's the best work on Greek myths that I think I've read. So if you're interested in them, then read Greek Myths by Robert Graves. Then we've got The Republic by Plato, Myths and Legends of Ancient Britain, Myths and Legends of the British by Maud Ebbott. Another book by Peter Berris Fidelis, we've got The Mammoth Book of Celtic Myths and Legends. Then a bit of Irish mythology, we've got The High Deeds of Finn MacCool by Rosemary Sutcliffe. Then we've got The Ecclesiastical History of the English People by Bede, who was an English monk in the 8th century. Now that's a very interesting read if you're interested in the early Anglo-Saxon period. And then for some reason I've got two versions of the Mabinogion, which is a collection of ancient Welsh oral histories, well not histories, oral myths, legends. There's some very early mentions of King Arthur in there, and it's a very interesting insight into early British culture. And then we've got The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, which in spite of the name is not actually a history of the kings of Britain. It's just a story that this monk from the medieval period just kind of made up. There's a load of stuff about King Arthur in there and how King Arthur basically conquered the whole of Europe. There's a weird section in the middle where it's got the prophecies of Merlin. I mean, it's a pretty crazy read, but it was one of the very early influences on the development of the legend of King Arthur. And then another stage of the development of the legends of King Arthur, we've got Chrétien de Troyes. You'll have to excuse my pronunciation of the French names. And this is his Arthurian romances. And this is really where we start to see the legends of King Arthur that we would recognise today start to come about. And they really informed Sir Thomas Malory. This is the first volume of his Le Mort d'Arthur, which means the death of Arthur in French. And this was written in the 15th century, but really this is the basis of most modern interpretations of the King Arthur legends. And for the sake of completeness, there's the second volume. And then we've got Arthurian Myth and Legend, an A to Z of People and Places, which is a really useful reference book if you're interested in the subject. That's by Mike Dixon Kennedy. And then we've got the Arthurian Legends, which is like a modern anthology of the Arthurian legends that I picked up from somewhere, and that's selected and introduced by Richard Barber. Then we've got a bit of Anglo-Saxon mythology, we've got Beowulf, and some like 13th century, I think, Icelandic mythology. We've got the Laxdæla saga. And last but not least, we've got Roger Lancelyn Green's retellings of the legends of Robin Hood. This is called The Adventures of Robin Hood. Okay, so I realised that was probably a bit niche, but if you're interested in history, if you're interested in mythology, then maybe there was something in there for you. If you have read any of those books, then let me know, or if you want to know more about any of them, then just let me know in the comments. But yeah, I guess that's all for today, so bye.